Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome everybody to Hands-On Apologetics. I'm Gary Michuta. It's great to be with you. Hope everybody had a great weekend. And I realize every time, every time I start this broadcast, I always start by saying we have a great program in store for you today. But we do have a great program. It's an awesome one. And we are going to dive into the author of one of the most important books to have been written by a Catholic, maybe in the last couple of decades. And that is The Closing of the Muslim Mind by Robert Reilly. And it's I can't explain to you how important it was, at least for me. And I do a lot of work, or at least I used to, with the Chaldean community up here in the Detroit area. Chaldeans are Iraqi Catholics who, they've emigrated to the United States, and they know Islam like the back of their hand. And so while I was with them, I was trying to soak up like a sponge as much as I possibly could about Islam. And but a lot of the things that they said just didn't make sense. And it wasn't until I read Robert Reilly's book that suddenly everything fit together. And so I've been dying to have Robert Reilly on the show for quite a while, and finally came out. So that's what we have in store for you. We're going to be talking about Islam after the first break. That's going to be very exciting. We also have our critical thinking exercises for today. For example, today we're going to have Finding the Fallacy, which today's fallacy comes by a rather embarrassing name known as the poo-poo fallacy. And also, the Meet the Early Church Father for today is the Council of Elvira. The Council of Elvira. So we got lots in store. Lots in store for you today on Hands-On Apologetics. And also, you are part of the show. So if you'd like to talk to Robert Reilly, maybe you'll have a question, give us a call at 888-526-2151. That is 888-526-2151. And love to hear from you. Also, you can send your questions via email at questions@handsonapologetics.com. And that is the official Dojo mailbox. And I know a lot of people are sometimes shy about going on the air, talking in public, and so sometimes you can just share through email. We'd love to hear from you. It's questions@handsonapologetics, all one word, and shoot us an email. And now it's time for our shout outs for today. As always, we want to say hello to everybody watching live stream via YouTube and Facebook. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. It's great to see familiar names. And also the explosion emojis is greatly appreciated as well. This is fun, isn't it, folks? Let's see. Hello, Gary. Great to see you. Okay, well, I'm glad you could see me, folks, because I look at my monitor and I see a screenshot of the studio and all sorts of interesting equipment. So I'm glad you can see me, although I personally think the video detracts from the show. Personally think so. So why don't we jump into our exercises? Let's see. I did my shout-outs. I did the anything else? Podcast. Yes, we also have people listening to podcasts. Welcome, podcast listeners, and for those who may miss the show but would like to access the show, you can always go to the flagship website for Hands-On Apologetics, which is Virgin Most Powerful Radio. You can access all the great programs there. And also, by the way, we're now available on iHeartRadio as well. So if you're an iHeartRadio fan, you can get the show via that way as well. Oh, that's strange. Yeah, I'm seeing something completely different on my end, Richard. Sorry, just chatting with the engineer. Let's go to the finding the fallacy for today. Okay, good. Finding a fallacy is the poo-poo fallacy. Sorry for the word, but that is what it's called. Although this is, as you know, with informal fallacies, there's usually multiple names. This is the informal logic that consists in dismissing an argument as being unworthy of serious consideration. Excuse me. Scholars generally characterize the fallacy as a rhetorical advice which the speaker ridicules an argument without responding to the substance of the argument. This is basically shooting the messenger, perhaps, or just shooting the message without considering it. This is used a lot in apologetics, and it's usually what happens is you'll have somebody on YouTube, you'll have somebody on social media, and they will take somebody's argument. Maybe it's a Catholic argument, pro-life argument, whatever. And what they'll do is they'll just ridicule it, make fun of it, but they'll never actually address the facts of the issue. And by doing that, what they're doing is they're sending a social cue to the listeners saying, this isn't even worthy of your consideration, right? So they poo-poo it, so to speak. And that, of course, is the name of our fallacy for today, the finding the fallacy, the poo-poo argument. Okay, let's move on to something a little bit more elevated sounding, and that is the Meet the Early Church Father. And if you've listened to this program a while, you'll know that the early church fathers aren't always individual humans. Sometimes they're documents, sometimes they're councils, and today we have a Council of Elvira. Council of Elvira, it's met in the city of Elvira, which is actually a town not too far from present-day Granada in Spain. 19 bishops, including the celebrated Asius of Cordova, were present, along with 26 priests and deacons. The council was basically a kind of reform council. A large part of what they put out were in the forms of canons, and there's 81 canons. Most of these canons reflect legislation that came from North Africa, which at this time, we're talking 300s. The North African churches were very predominant there. I mean, and very influential in Christianity. Let's see. Numerous dates are assigned to this. Somewhere between 250 to 780. 380 is, I think, the most reasonable date, and I think most scholars are gravitating towards that date. Of the 81 canons were subscribed only to bishops. These canons, all disciplinary, are important because they shed much light on the religious and ecclesiastical life of Spanish Christians on the eve of the triumph of Christianity. So these canons, these 80-some canons, deal with marriage, baptism, idolatry, fasting, excommunication. It deals with cemeteries, not seminaries, usury, vigils, frequency of Mass, and relation of Christians to pagan Jews and heretics. Canon 33 is perhaps the oldest positive church ordinance that we have concerning the celibacy of the clergy, so it's a very important canon as far as getting in touch with the historical roots of clerical celibacy. Not to say that it started at this point, but that this is the first time it's been codified in the council. Let's see. There's also a Canon 13 exhibits the institution of nuns, who were, of course, they also predated by hundreds of years in Spain, but nevertheless, we have a first kind of official pronouncement. Canon 36, however, is one of the canons that are sometimes appealed to by anti-Catholics. It's a little bit problematic in a sense. Basically, it's urged as some sort of restriction on the veneration of images as practiced in the Catholic Church. And so non-Catholics will often look at this Canon 36 of the Council of Elvira and say, see, the Catholic Church at one time forbade the use of images. Well, several historians, including the great Hefel, interpreted this prohibition as directed against the use of images in underground churches only, lest the pagans should caricature sacred scenes or ideas. In other words, it was a restriction against images of certain scenes because they were afraid that the pagans would kind of incorporate it into their own pagan worship. So that's one theory that historians have. And another theory that's, the most prominent historian to propound this is a historian named Funk, F-U-N-K. They believe that the council didn't make any pronouncement in regards to the laicity or non-laicity of the use of images, but as an administrative measure simply forbade them, lest new and weak converts from paganism should incur thereby a danger of relapse to idolatry or be scandalized by certain superstitious accesses that in no way were approved by ecclesiastical authority. So there you have it. It's the Council of Elvira, and like I said, those are the two possible interpretations of it. Neither of them really support what anti-Catholics would think, that in a sense images were strictly forbidden, right? They're not allowed. But, it's just, since these are, canonical restrictions that impinge on discipline, they are only for certain locations and for certain times, and because they saw a present danger, and then after the danger ceases, then the canons change. And that's our Meet the Early Church Father for today, the Council of Elvira. Coming up on the other side of the break, we have Robert Reilly talking about the closing of the Muslim mind. Stay tuned, folks.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. We are going to talk about Islam, folks. And like I said at the beginning of the program, one of the most influential books, I believe one of the most important books written in the last few decades that every Catholic and every non-Catholic should read is the author is Robert Reilly, and the book is The Closing of the Muslim Mind. And that was so insightful for me, and it was able to bring together all sorts of very interesting information that I gleaned over the years and make sense of it. So without further ado, let me introduce him. Robert Reilly is Senior Fellow at the American Foreign Policy Center Council.
Actually, I'm not.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So you're a former Senior Fellow.
I'm I'm director of the Westminster Institute. Sorry to jump in there, but that hasn't been the case for 4 years.
Oh, okay. Well, hey, well then, we'll jump right in the program and tell us a little bit about what you've been doing over the past few years.
Well, for the past 4, I've been the director of a small public policy educational institute here in Northern Virginia that focuses on the Islamic world, personal dignity, religious freedom, etc. So we're never going to run out of work.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very good. Very good. And he wrote numerous books, and the book that we're going to talk about today is The Closing of the Muslim Mind, How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamic Crisis. I guess the first question I should ask you is, how did the idea for the book come about? Because it isn't something like a household conversation. People talk about this all the time.
Well, it's indeed it's not. I was trying to answer a question. It became very evident, both through my reading and personal experiences, as to what went wrong in the Islamic, particularly the Arab world. But the question, and of course Bernard Lewis wrote a very famous book on what went wrong. But the real question that puzzled me is, why did it go wrong? And that led me on a 10-year quest of reading and thinking about Islam. And some of my work was associated with the Islamic world at that time when I was still in the government. And when I left the government, I sort of dedicated myself full-time to boring in on this and discovering how it was that the Islamic civilization, which was the site of so many achievements in the early Middle Ages, went into a decline from which it hasn't recovered and has become close to the most dysfunctional part of the world. Now, that's a real puzzle.
Yeah. How
did that happen? Why did that happen? And my book is the attempt to give the answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the book. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the hour, I did a lot of work with Chaldean Catholics who know Islam like the back of their hands. And over the years working with them, they would say things that just wouldn't make sense to me. Like, for example, they would say that the terrorists are not like a fringe minority. Those are the believers. It's the non-terrorists that are the atheists. Or they would say, or I'd hear stories about how servicemen in Iraq would tell chieftains
I'm afraid I couldn't hear you. That dropped out.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's just there's lots of different things that they would say. Like, for example, servicemen in Iraq would tell tribal chieftains that supplies would be in next Wednesday, and the chieftains would be stunned to find out that it would come next Wednesday because they couldn't figure out how Allah, would be cooperating with these Americans, and they seem to know what Allah's thinking, And so over the years, I had all these strange, seemingly contradictory ideas, and it wasn't until I read your book that suddenly everything made sense.
Well, thank you. I've had that experience too. I was talking with one Christian from northern Iraq who dedicates himself to documenting the persecution of Christians, of what happened under ISIS and otherwise. Mm-hmm. And in a conversation, he said there's a little ISIS in every Muslim. The question is whether it's going to get out. Now, another way of putting that, I think, is by the great French scholar Remy Brague, who, when he said that it's a difference of degree, not of kind, as to whether you are the peaceful Muslim who lives in harmony with your Christian or other neighbors, or whether you're an ISIS person. That's a difference of degree and not of kind. And I think what Remy Brague meant, and what the Iraqi meant, is that there's a deep theological problem in Islam. That is, I should be more specific and say in Sunni Islam, and then get even more specific by saying in the Asharite theological school of Sunni Islam, which is by far the majority school of theology in Sunni Islam. There are no sort of breakwaters that say you can go this far and no further. There's nothing really to stop them if they choose to radicalize, and there are plenty of reasons to do it. So it depends on a whole host of different factors as to whether they join this radical violent ideology or not. But if you look within Islam and say, well, no, you can't do that because it says this here, you're not going to. That'll be a problem. It'll be very hard to do that because these people are true to the texts. I mean, they're not making up the text they use to justify the way in which they behave. Now, there are many. Obviously, the vast majority of Muslims don't behave this way, and there are also good reasons for them not to. But you will notice that even a place like Al-Azhar, the sort of most prestigious educational institution in the Muslim world, certainly the Arab Muslim world, the Grand Mufti or the Sheikh there won't say that, say, bin Laden is not a Muslim. Because he has no grounds upon which to do so. And, of course, it's considered a very bad thing for one Muslim to say another is not a Muslim when he himself declares himself to be one. So this is a very, very, very big problem. And if what is the theological problem that spawns this? It's their conception of God as pure will and power and not of reason.
Right.
You see, I think there's nothing peculiar to Islam in terms of this ideology because I think every monotheistic religion is at some point has to confront the same questions, just as Christianity did. And Christianity came very close to going off the rails in respect to the question of God's relationship to reason. And as we know, during the Reformation, the sola scriptura, sola fides, sola gratia, school came very close to the very same positions within Sunni Islam.
Right.
That there's no relationship between faith and reason. It's a delegitimization of reason. And in my own opinion, what the breakwater within Christianity is the opening of the Gospel of St. John. In the beginning was the Word, which is, of course, in the original Greek, logos. So in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was God, and all things are made through him as logos. Well, logos means not just word in Greek, it means reason. So if God introduces himself to us as reason, you have a much harder time delegitimizing reason. And I think it's the fact that logos is at the heart of Christianity, that it can find its way home again when it's wandered off into these voluntaristic versions of itself, whereas unfortunately Sunni Islam has become largely voluntaristic. That means, again, that God is pure will and power and has no relationship to what we conceive of as reason.
Right. Yeah.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah, we could take the whole rest of the show to unpack that. Since we only have a few more minutes before our first break. Now, Islam wasn't always like that, though, was it? There was a period where they came in contact with Greek literature, for example, and Christians, of course.
Yeah, that's an extreme. In fact, that what you're the subject you just raised is the heart of my book. It's the drama between the first two theological schools in Islam, the first of which, the Mutazilites, had been heavily influenced by Greek philosophy as it was manifested in Christian apologetics. So in the early 9th century, the Mutazilites set forth a view of God that tied in his reason, the rational order in creation, and the ability of man's reason to apprehend that rational order and to, through it, come to the notion of God himself. So, and they also understood that their revelation in the Quran had to be understood in a way that did not abuse that reason. That, in other words, Allah, or God, would not expect them to believe anything that was unreasonable, against their reason. So this, as I mentioned, was the first theological school, and the Caliph at the time, Al-Mamun, who was the greatest sponsor of Hellenic thinking, I think, in the history of Islam, it prospered, but in reaction to it arose the Asherite view, which denied all of the tenets that I just mentioned to you. God isn't reason. Man, through his reason, cannot come to know the difference between right and wrong. You can only know that through revelation. And therefore, and also the Quran is simply to be understood literally and obeyed completely, and reason is not a standard through which you either come to understand it or really interpret it. So it's, this devolved today where you can see mottos: abandon reason and submit to the text.
Very good. Yeah. Well, hey, we'll continue the discussion after this break. We're talking with Robert Reilly and the closing of the Muslim mind. Stay tuned, everybody.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We are chatting with Robert Reilly, the author of the book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind, Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis. And right before the break, Robert, you were discussing how Islam imbibed some Aristotle, some Hellenism, some Christianity, and I guess you could call them the rational party because they believe that Allah or God is rational. He creates things that are reasonable, and so we can know God through looking at things. And then there was the advent of the irrational party that said, no, God creates surely by will, almost like arbitrary will. So you can't really know what God or Allah is thinking or wills unless it's through divine revelation. Is that a fair synopsis?
It is, and I think I like to use two statements that I think make the differences clear between the Mutazilite school and then the Asharite school, which followed it. The first is from Abdul Jabbar, who was one of the last really significant Mutazilite philosophers or theologians. Here's what he said, quote, "It is obligatory for you to carry out what accords with reason," unquote. Obligatory to carry out what accords with reason. That line could be from Aristotle. It could be from Thomas Aquinas. Now, the opposing school, its most proponent member was Al-Ghazali. His teacher, Al-Juwani, said, quote, "There is nothing obligatory by reason for the servant of God." Nothing. And Al-Ghazali himself said, quote, "No obligations flow from reason, but from the Sharia." Right? So right and wrong is not apprehensible. You can't come to know it through your reason. So no moral philosophy, no Aristotle's ethics, et cetera, et cetera. So you're reduced to simply the revelation and the Sharia. So this is unfortunately, the Asharite school became dominant not because it won the argument, but because three caliphs after Al-Mamun, the caliph changed his mind and suppressed the Mutazilites, and the Asharite school became dominant. And it became basically institutionalized, and it continues in the Muslim world today. Now, key to this notion that God is pure will and power and not reason and justice is that he is the cause of everything, but he's not just the prime cause, as we Christians would say. God is the prime cause, but he allows secondary causes, like gravity. No. In the Asharite school, there are no secondary causes. There's just God who directly does everything, unmediated by anything. Yeah. So there are no natural causes in the natural world. Fire doesn't burn cotton, God does. And there's no connection between the fire touching the cotton and the cotton igniting. Each of those are discrete and separate things that God directly does, and he might choose to do it differently the next time fire touches cotton. And if you were to say, no, that's happening according to a natural law and the properties of fire and cotton, that would be shirk, that would be blasphemy. As you can see, this would militate against the development of modern science, which of course it did, which is why there's practically no original science conducted in the Arab world today. I like to use this little quote to show how current this unfortunate way of thinking is. The founder of the Nigerian terrorist group Boko Haram, Muhammad Yusuf, who's now dead, he died in captivity, said this, quote, "There are prominent Islamic preachers who have seen and understood that the present Western-style education is mixed with issues that run contrary to our beliefs in Islam, like rain. We believe it is a creation of God rather than an evaporation caused by the sun that condenses and becomes rain. Like saying the world is a sphere. If it runs contrary to the teachings of Allah, we reject it." Unquote. So you see, he understands perfectly what the scientific explanation of rain is, the cause and effect involved in producing rain, but rejects it because the teaching is God directly does each of those discrete things.
Yeah. In fact, you had one quote, and I'm just from memory, that floored me. It was a Muslim scientist who said it's un-Islamic to say if you combine hydrogen with oxygen, you get water. It would be Islamic to say that by Allah's will, when you combine the two, then it becomes water.
Inshallah. Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's so. There was the famous Lebanese American writer Fuad Ajami. One afternoon I heard him say, "Everywhere I go in the Muslim world, it's the same thing, cause and effect, cause and effect." So I said, "Fuad, let's talk about this for a while." And indeed, it was his experience that the cause and effect the causality was denied as a matter of faith. And what the things you opened the program with, saying that people are puzzled if something is promised for a Wednesday delivery and it arrives.
Yeah.
Our troops who were having trouble getting some of our Iraqi allies to wear their Kevlar vests. And why wouldn't you wear a Kevlar vest if you're going into battle? Well, their point of view is if I'm going to be hit by a bullet and die, it's by the will of Allah. And the Kevlar vest won't stop it. Or why don't they wear seat belts? Well, if my time has come, the seatbelt isn't going to save me. And if my time hasn't come, why should I wear the seatbelt? So this is this sense of fatalism. I mean, I think aside from your extremely generous review of the book, some Americans who have spent their whole working lives in the Middle East occasionally contact me. Somehow they found my book, and they say, oh, now we get it. I always wondered why these people behave this way. Now I understand.
Yeah, it brought everything together for me, and because it just seemed like a mess of contradictions. And I thought, well, they must be misunderstanding it. But then when I read your book, it's like, no, they didn't misunderstand it. It just doesn't make sense. Well, it does in their own system, but according to our sense.
I met a Kurdish, young Kurdish fellow, and he and I were discussing this kind of thing, and he told me a story about going on the Hajj in Saudi Arabia with a very pious friend of his who was clearly of this Asherite school. And they were discussing these very same issues about the nature of God's essence and so forth. And as they were circling the Kaaba, his very pious friend touched the black stone, and it was cool to the touch, and he turned to the Kurdish fellow and said, see? In this blazing hot Saudi sun, the black stone is cool to the touch. That is proof that God does this directly. And my Kurdish, more skeptical acquaintance said, that's interesting, that this was a miracle right before them. So he walks around the Kaaba till he finds a set of stairs going down, at the bottom of which is a refrigeration unit. So he takes his pious friend down there and points to the refrigeration and said, that's why the black stone is cool. The pious friend was outraged that he should have been shown such a thing, because it would establish causality, which is precisely what he wouldn't believe in, you see, that was an offense to his faith. That was shirk. So this is an enormous stumbling block. Yeah. Enormous.
Yeah. We have only a couple more minutes before the next break, but why don't we trace, what is the outcome of this? How has it shaped the Islamic world that operates with this kind of philosophy?
Well, it's operating with a lack of philosophy. I mean, the subtitle of my book comes from this Pakistani Muslim thinker Fazlur Rahman, who said, quote, a people that deprives itself of philosophy necessarily exposes itself to starvation in terms of fresh ideas. In fact, it commits intellectual suicide, unquote. And that's what's happened. Yeah. You extirpate philosophy, which means, by this I mean critical thinking. And critical thinking based upon an understanding of cause and effect in the natural world. If you exclude that, you're dead.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in fact, the last third of your book, you kind of chronicle all the different ways in which intellectual output or capital just shrank after the adoption of this.
Well, it happened slowly. It just didn't happen overnight, but I believe it accounts for what we see today in the dysfunctional nature of the Arab world. If there's another reason that lets us understand it more thoroughly, I haven't heard it yet, and that's why it took me so long to write this book, to find that reason, and I think I have.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the explanatory power alone, points to there certainly is more than a kernel of truth here.
I have to tell you also, Gary, that it's Muslim, Arab, intellectual reformer friends of mine who insisted this book be translated and available in Arabic, which it is now.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, very good. Well, on the other side of the break, I want to pick your brain as far as some of the things you have to say about how, according to this outlook, people believe conspiracy theories, things like that. So we're talking with Robert Reilly. Stay tuned.
This is Terry Barber inviting you, all the men, to a men's conference June 15th at the Sacred Heart Chapel. This is going to be a day where we're going to talk about true masculinity. There's a problem in the Catholic Church today. We have very few men who love the Catholic faith. And I know a lot of the wives that I'm listening to right now saying, I want my husband to be on fire for the faith. Send him to the men's conference. Your son, send him to the men's conference by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org or call 877-526-2151. That's June 15th. When your husband comes back from this conference, or your son, they're going to have a different view about their Catholic faith, because they're going to meet three men who love Jesus and his bride, the church, and are going to instill in them a love for Christ and his church, the Eucharist, Our Lady. Bring them to virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Sign up there or call 877-526-2151. Full sheen ahead.
It is only because of your continued prayers and generous donations that Virgin Most Powerful Radio can broadcast live each weekday. We count on your spiritual and financial support because you understand the urgent need for Catholic programming that shares the gospel with clarity and charity, but without compromise. Please prayerfully consider becoming a monthly donor. You can set it up with the touch of a button on our website, catholicrc.org.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Robert Reilly, the author of the book, The Closing of the Muslim Mind. I highly recommend it. It will help you. I guarantee you it will help you to understand the Islamic world, or at least it's a good entree to understanding the Islamic world. And Robert, before the break, I mentioned this. You mentioned how that intellectual capital kind of disappeared. There's not very many books produced by countries that this is predominant. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. You find most of these statistics in the UN Human Development Reports that I think began around 2001, all written by Arabs, by the way, in which they catalog the kind of intellectual, cultural devastation throughout the Arab Muslim world in terms of education, patents for inventions, healthcare, etc., and find that it's, according to world surveys, at the next to the bottom. Only sub-Saharan Africa is worse.
Wow.
So it's extremely significant. I'm on the board of a institution called the Middle East Media Research Institute, which makes available a great deal of Arab media, both on television, what's said in the mosques on Friday, translations from articles, interviews, etc. It's invaluable service so that you can know how they talk to each other and how they account for things and what explanations they give for what is happening in the world. And what you find is, not surprisingly, conspiracy theories are rife. And there is nothing too absurd for them to put forth as an explanation for something because they've abandoned rationality. And when you do that, you substitute it with all kinds of utter nonsense. You probably have seen the surveys that in the Muslim world, or particularly in the Arab world, the more evidence, there is an inverse relationship between the amount of evidence as to who committed the actions on 9/11 against the United States and the number of Arabs who believe it. So the more evidence that bin Laden and his gang did this, the fewer Arabs believe that he did do it. There's a complete disconnect. And I'm trying to explain in the book why.
Yeah, because this kind of occasionalism or voluntarism, it kind of unravels the fabric of reality, doesn't it? That if everything is Allah's direct will and there's no secondary causes, then anything's possible.
Both anything is possible, and the result is this kind of fatalism. There's nothing really you can do about it. You just accept the will of Allah, and that's what you're here to do. But I mean, there are instructions. There are things you are supposed to do according to the Quran and the Sharia. So this is, there are Arab Muslims who understand this. We, at the Westminster Institute, we try to work with them and have published a book called Reforming Islam, all written by them. And throughout this book, you will find them boring in on the problems that I'm talking about and saying the exact same things.
Yeah.
They understand. The problem is many of these people aren't in their home countries because it's not safe for them to be there to say these things because they're considered impious and sometimes blasphemous.
Right.
So this is a very another key issue in Islam, and that was at the heart of the battle between the Mutazilites and the Ash'arites back in the 9th century, is the status of the Quran. Whether it has existed in eternity as it is today, or whether it was created in time. Still Allah's revelation, but to a specific people in certain cultural circumstances in the language which they spoke, right? The way in which Christians understand their revelation.
Right.
And therefore it's susceptible to interpretation. And this, of course, was the view of the Mutazilites, that this was a creation in history. It didn't exist always. It's only when Allah spoke, through Gabriel to Muhammad and he took down this supposed dictation. Now, the Ash'arites said, no, this has always existed exactly as it exists today in, heaven and paradise with Allah, with not any jot or tittle of it changed. And therefore, if you hold the Quran today, you are holding exactly what has existed eternally with Allah. Now, as you can imagine, there's not very much room for interpretation if that is the case. In other words, the revelation is not contingent on history, on linguistics, on anything. God, in fact, speaks Arabic.
Right.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So that it's and that is by the way, if you wonder why Muslims react if the Quran is stepped on or a leaf of it is burned or something like it, it's because of what they think it is.
Right.
As a German theologian said to me, we have incarnation, God becoming Christ. They have in liberation, God becoming book, or God as book.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially since even in the Quran there's abrogated verses too. So how do they square that?
They're abrogated verses. Yeah, right. Because the Quran is contradictory within itself. It's they have to understand it in some way. So which of the contradictory things in the Quran are the ones you're supposed to follow, and therefore the doctrine of abrogation, the later the better. And, of course, it's the violent verses that come later and the peaceful verses that come earlier.
Right. Did you find any? What's the rationale for clericalism? Why didn't Islam end up just being individual Muslims interpreting the Quran, on their own? Why do clerics have to interpret it?
No, it did end up that way. And the fact that the clerics have no authority compared to what clerics in Christianity have. But the fact is, it's not a matter of interpretation. It's a matter of behavior. As has often been said, in Islam, there's not orthodoxy, there's orthopraxis. In other words, if you observe the 5 requirements with Islam, and if you say there is no God but God and Muhammad is prophet, you're a Muslim. And if you pray 5 times a day, you're a Muslim. And if you go on the Hajj, you're a Muslim. It doesn't really matter what you believe. It matters what you do. You see, so there's that.
No, that makes perfect sense.
But there's no pope. So if Osama bin Laden says, well, no, Allah, we're supposed to behave just the way we did in the 7th century, and we're supposed to attack the infidels and go on jihad, just as did Muhammad and the righteous caliphs. Well, it's hard to tell them, well, that's not what you're supposed to do.
Right, yeah. And now we're talking about a sect within Sunni Islam, right? Are there other sects of Islam that are closer or a little bit more Hellenized than this? And how
yes, but
influential are they?
They're negligible.
Okay.
They're negligible. It's the Asherite sect that has dominated. In addition, by the way, I should tell you that I did a monograph on Catholic-Muslim dialogue that's available, in which I go into the problems that Catholics and bishops have talking to Muslims who, almost without exception, are Asherites because they don't the Muslims aren't trying to deceive them. It's just they don't have any conception of the world of meaning from which the Muslims are speaking to them.
Yeah.
So if they say, oh, we're for justice too, they have no notion of what the Muslims mean by justice, which means justice according to Sharia.
Yes.
They don't understand if we want a common word with you, that's a Quranic version in which Muhammad is telling the Christians you should become Muslims.
Right. Yeah, very good.
That Islam, if Islam is about anything, it's about the denial of the Incarnation, the denial of the Trinity, the denial of the crucifixion, and the denial of the resurrection. That is almost the core of Islam. Islam is more a reaction against Christianity than it is anything itself.
Interesting.
So this idea that there's some kind of, and the problem is, I talked to Muslims. I have a number of good Muslim friends, and some with whom I work on these issues. So they are there. The problem is they don't have any purchase within the Muslim world. They're the ones who are ignored. They're the ones who are in danger.
Yeah.
But believe me, I can guarantee you that none of them are helped by any Western government. They're ignored, and they're unaware of their existence. And it's because the Western governments, and I include our own, have absolutely no understanding of what you and I have just been talking about.
Exactly. And that's why I think your book is so important. And where can people get a hold of the rest of your work?
I think my books are on Amazon, or any other online, including the one on the prospects and perils of Catholic-Muslim dialogue. But certainly, The Closing of the Muslim Mind is there. As you know, Gary, it's a difficult read because my perspective is that what we're dealing with here is a theological problem.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So that's the way we have to approach it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on the program. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's been great, Gary. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That is Robert Reilly, folks. The book is The Closing of the Muslim Mind. I highly recommend you pick it up. Like I said, I think it's one of the most important books to be written in the last couple of decades. Well, coming up tomorrow, Rod Bennett joins us. We're going to be talking about bad shepherds. And coming up next, the Terry and Jesse Show, High Impact Catholic Talk Radio coming at you. This is fun. I wish we had a few programs with Robert because there is so much here, folks. So it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center and turn off the lights. Have a good day.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, You can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.